Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our guests. Thank you for joining us today. I have us currently on speaker view. Uh, we are recording. I'm just so happy to welcome Vickie MacArthur. How kind it is of you to come and share your work with us. Um, Vickie has a very special walk within our tradition and the Christian tradition as well. And so she has just lovely things to share from deep in the spirit. So, Vickie, it is all yours. Welcome. We're so happy you're here with us today.
Mm, Thank you. Dear Thai, dear Sangha, it is such a joy to be here and to share with you. And I also see a few dear friends from some of my own communities. So, Colleen and Rita, welcome. That's what I love about some of the readings I've done is this integration of communities. And so I join you from Lethbridge, Alberta, traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and acknowledging that that is just a small part of this path to healing and reconciliation. And while I'm not a regular member of Two Palms Up, I have attended online retreats with both Michael and with Jonathan. And I've really connected to them and their sanghas. And they're both beautiful teachers of the Dharma and Thai's teachings and continuation. So thank you. So, A Lotus on Fire, How a Buddhist Monk Ignited My Heart. You can guess who it's about. Um, it was sparked by a moment of awakening with Thai at a retreat in Vancouver, British Columbia in 2011, just after my mother had passed away from ovarian cancer. And I had sat with her during that palliative journey and was also there when she breathed her last breath, a very uh, sacred and heartbreaking moment. And so, as you can imagine, I went to this retreat with a very raw and vulnerable heart, and I just wanted some quiet space to be with my feelings of grief and loss. It was my first retreat in the Plum Village tradition, and I was not expecting so many people, over 1,000 people. So I was quite overwhelmed and wondered how was I going to find this place of quiet that I really needed. Um, but I finally settled into the rhythm of the practice and, of course, allowed myself to be held by the collective energy of the Sangha that is generated in a retreat like that and is generated online for us as we practice together. So during Ty's question and answer talk at the end of the retreat, I somehow found myself sitting close to Ty on stage in front of all these people. Um, Thankfully, because I was really nervous, time ran out before I could answer to ask my question, and so I didn't actually get to ask my question out loud, but I did receive a silent answer in the depths of my heart. At one point, as I looked over, Ty turned and gazed at me with those loving eyes that just seemed to look into the depths of one's soul, this just gaze of love. And it felt like what I imagined it would be like to look into the eyes of the living Buddha or the living Christ. And this was a very mystical moment beyond time and space for me. It awakened and opened my eyes to a new way of being and began a long journey of inner transformation. So when I got home from the retreat, I began to write in my journals. And this was a way of processing and understanding this experience. I've journaled almost all my life. And I wrote in the format of letters to Thai. I think if you've been in the Plum Village tradition, you know how much Thai loves to receive letters. And so I wrote to Thai in my journal about that experience, but also about other experiences and retreats that I got to attend with him afterwards, and then traveling to Plum Village in France. And I was weaving in stories of my own life along with teachings and practices of both Plum Village and from my Christian and yogic traditions. So slowly over time, A Lotus on Fire began to take form and shape from those letters and journal entries. So A Lotus on Fire touches in on some different themes, including interspirituality and building bridges between different spiritual traditions, embodied practices of breathing and yoga, and integrating practices of mindfulness, or what we call in the Christian tradition holy attention. Yet one of the themes that emerged for me while I was writing was a theme of grieving, not surprisingly, since I had just lost my mother. So today I'd like to share some of those passages about my personal experience and journey through grief, but also integrating some of Thai's practices for healing the inner child and for ancestral healing. I also use my own practices from my yogic tradition, Yoga Nidra, which is a lying down form of meditation. It's similar to Plum Village's practice of total relaxation. So I guess I'll start reading now that you've had the little introduction to it. And we start with one of Thai's well-known gathas for healing our inner child. Breathing in, I see myself as a 5-year-old girl. Breathing out, I smile to my 5-year-old self. Breathing in, I see the 5-year-old girl hurt and vulnerable. Breathing out, I embrace my 5-year-old self. Breathing in, I see my mother as a 5-year-old girl. Breathing out, I smile to my mother as a young girl. Breathing in, I see my mother hurt and vulnerable. Breathing out, I embrace my 5-year-old mother. Dear Thai, this morning in our meditation practice, we were guided to see ourselves as a 5-year-old child. Then imagine our mother and father at the same innocent age. I can see my mother out on the old farm in the Dust Bowl of the Alberta prairies after the 1930s stock market crash. Her father had died of leukemia when she was just 2 years old, leaving my grandmother to raise 7 girls all by herself, working her fingers to the bone to try and keep the family farm. As the youngest of 7, my mother, Patricia, was the one who had to sleep with her mother in the same bed where her father and mother used to sleep. After the death of her father, my mother would lie absolutely still in the darkness, listening to the sounds of my grandmother crying and sobbing. It was all too much for a young girl at such a tender age. So my mother would turn her back and hug her tiny limbs in to block out the sound. There they lay, 2 grieving souls, lying back to back without touching. This was a very strong memory for my mother, who always regretted not turning towards her mother and hugging her with her tiny arms. As my mother lay dying, she shared this painful story with me. I received it back into my heart. I wondered if my mother's pain could still be present in me. Do I have the tendency to hold back the tears or turn away from pain instead of facing it? Or have these practices of breathing and sensing and feeling slowly been transforming this ancestral pain into understanding and compassion for my own generational pain, while the healing flows forwards to future generations? The tears my mother cried yesterday have become rain. This next section is called We Hold Our Issues in Our Tissues. Dear Tai, I find myself saying we hold our issues in our tissues when teaching yoga. It seems like a trite and oversimplified phrase, but it carries a lot of truth. Similarly, you often say that our mother and father are present in every cell of our body. I think most people understand this at some level. Just like we are what we eat, we are also what we think or have experienced. You've been talking about the 4 nutrients: edible food, sense impressions, volition, and consciousness. We are always consuming through our mouth, our eyes, our nose, our body, our mind. We have to be careful what we are consuming so we are feeding and nourishing our love instead of suffering. All of our memories, all our feelings are stored in our body. As a yoga teacher, I know this deep in my muscles and bones. But I also know that we are complicated beings with lifetimes of feelings to be felt and healed and expressed. I still sense there's more under the surface for me, and I want to go deeper to understand. I want to release any feelings that might be blocked. I know that the unconscious part of me wants to stay in the dark, making this a deep and difficult practice. When you talk about consciousness in your Dharma talks, you divide consciousness into mind and store consciousness. You compare mind consciousness to the living room, where we entertain guests, and store consciousness to the basement, where we hide everything we don't want visitors to see. Mind consciousness is like our everyday conscious mind, and store consciousness is like our unconscious mind. There are many seeds that lie in our unconscious basement, both wholesome and unwholesome. Sometimes feelings of sadness or anger can arise in me out of the blue. I know these feelings arise from my own past experiences, but they can also arise from the experiences of past generations stored in my cellular memory. You teach that if the seed of sadness or grief has arisen from the basement of our store consciousness into our mind consciousness, our practice is to gently embrace it with our seed of mindfulness and compassion and help it return to the basement. Each time we do this, it becomes weaker and will no longer have control over us. Whereas if we continue to feed these negative thoughts and feelings, they will continue to appear in our living room and act out in uncontrollable ways. Perhaps my slowly seeping tears are my gentle way of moving through different layers of grief over many years. I know I need to hold these practices lightly. Sometimes I get so attached or caught up in how to do a practice right or in comparing my practice to others that I forget to follow my own intuition. Too often, I allow other people's thoughts and opinions to overshadow my own knowing. True discernment and practice allows me to tune into my own inner wisdom. So I have one more package, one more reading to read. I'm wondering if we might have a sound of the bell. That would be just lovely to collect at least myself back in, please. This next section is called When We Know How to Suffer, We Suffer Much Less. Dear Thai, since starting yoga over 20 years ago, this ancient spiritual practice has been slowly weaving itself into the fabric of my life. Like many, I originally thought yoga was a set of postures and exercises to stay healthy and flexible. Over the years, I have learned it is so much more. It's a practice that has completely transformed my life. Perhaps that's why I so resonate with you and these practices: breathing, walking, listening, deep relaxation. It is the Plum Village yoga practice of embodied movement, breath, and interbeing. Through yoga, I have fallen in love with the intimacy of my own breath and with the mystery that same breath points to. Through yoga, I have connected to my body in a loving way, learning to pay attention to subtle sensations I would not have been aware of in the past. Through yoga, I have learned to recognize and be with tension and discomfort in my physical body. Through yoga, I have learned how to breathe into and be with feelings of anger or frustration or sadness. Instead of a practice, yoga has become a way of inhabiting my body and my life. It's simply a way of being, and this way of being has led me to you. One of the practices that has brought much healing to my own life and that of my students is the practice of Yoga Nidra. It is similar to the Plum Village practice of deep relaxation in that it not only helps to relax, but also to release deeply held tension and trauma. I believe this practice has helped to heal some of the deepest parts of my soul and psyche. I've been practicing it here at Deer Park Monastery. Every afternoon during rest time, I take my yoga mat and climb up the steep, winding path past the small stupa halfway up the mountain and up to the very top plateau where a huge white stone Buddha sits, peacefully looking out over the valley. I try to find a shady place away from the hot sun and lie down on my yoga mat in the yogic posture of Shavasana, or corpse pose. Most people don't realize that Shavasana is not just a posture of relaxation, but rather a posture of learning to let go and to die before we die. As we surrender back to the earth, we die to the idea of a separate self so we can feel our oneness and interbeing. Slowly scanning my body, I can feel myself dissolving deeper and deeper through the Maya koshas, or layers of consciousness. Sometimes I float somewhere between being awake and a soft dreamscape where images arise and dissolve like clouds. Other times I completely fall asleep, then awaken to find vultures circling to see whether I might be a tasty morsel they can swoop down and eat. Yet a part of me stays awake. Something is moving deep in my being without my even being aware as I gaze into the vast blue sky above me. Yoga Nidra has healed me in ways both conscious and unconscious. I used this practice while my mother was dying in palliative care. Almost every night I would come home after spending the day by her bedside and lie on my yoga mat or my bed and breathe and send love all through my body. Sometimes I would fall asleep exhausted. Other times I could feel the places in me that were bracing against the pain I was witnessing in my mother's eyes as the cancer relentlessly took her body. I could feel the little girl in me who was desperately afraid of losing her mother. Yet those years of cultivating an intimate, loving relationship with my own body and breath allowed me to hold this little girl, her tears gently pooling in the corners of my eyes. So I could go back the next day and simply sit and hold my mother's hand once more. Listen to her pain, both spoken and unspoken. Yesterday, as I laid here in this desert-like landscape with the vast sky above, the white statue of the Buddha as my witness, and the monastery in the distance, it came to me that I had already started my grieving before my mother took her last breath. Every time I lay down on my mat, it was my way of holding and embracing my little girl self. My grieving could be felt and released little by little as a continual process that started well before she died, as she died, and afterwards through memories and stories of her life. Perhaps I am also learning to embrace the little girl in my mother, who lost her father at the tender age of 2, and who lay in bed listening to the sobs that racked my grandmother's body. Perhaps that's how we heal generational suffering, by simply learning how to breathe and embrace our own sweet bodies and feelings exactly as they are, knowing they contain the DNA of our ancestors and the dust of a distant star. We can trust those memories to arise exactly when they need to in order to be healed, just as I can trust the slow trickle of tears. This morning in your Dharma talk, you talked about transforming our suffering. If we listen to our suffering, understanding of that suffering along with its roots will naturally arise, along with compassion, as confirmation that I had somehow answered the question of my own heart. You turned and smiled at me and said, "When you know how to suffer, you suffer much less." As I looked into your eyes once more, I remembered one of the silent phrases imprinted on my mind in that magical moment back in Vancouver. You can be with suffering and not be overwhelmed. Can I finally receive this blessing fully for myself? Can I now become a compassionate vessel large enough to hold the tears of the world?
Wow. What a what a treat. Oh, thank you so much. So I'm hoping that it's okay with you if we open to some time for questions and answers, and maybe people's reactions or thoughts to these beautiful things that you brought forward. So if it's okay, I'll stop the recording at this point.